Having the history of being the first transcontinental railroad to head west and help build a growing country is a nice distinction, especially when you can survive those beginnings and operate into the start of the 21st century. Being first was no guarantee of success. However, the Union Pacific managed to survive its shaky beginnings and become a railroad with few equals. These 1969 filmed scenes show a UP on the eve of tremendous change and growth, and they were ready for the challenge. The changes would end over 100 years of scheduled passenger train operation, with Amtrak gathering up a nationwide passenger system to rescue it from extinction. The UP would then concentrate on freight operations and help secure the most efficient method of transporting the nation's freight. They would also have a wake-up call with the 1970 merger of a number of large systems to form the Burlington Northern. Historically, the UP sought its own merger with the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy to gain its own tracks from Omaha to Chicago almost 70 years earlier. We'll review several of these almost mergers and some successful expansions. The Union Pacific has a history of developing high horsepower locomotives and running fast freight to the prime markets in the West. We'll see some of these locomotive examples at many locations that have a story to tell. The UP developed high standards of equipment, track, maintenance, and facilities that gave them the resources to develop opportunities in good times, support the nation in 2 major world wars, and also carry them through the periodic recessions and even a worldwide depression of the 1930s. The equipment on this westbound train is typical of the Union Pacific city name trains, such as the City of Los Angeles from Chicago to Los Angeles, and others, such as the City of Portland and San Francisco. The railroads as an industry had shrinking passenger revenues after the Second World War, and a decline in service followed this trend for many. The UP kept its standards to the end despite losing government mail contracts that helped support the passenger train's revenue losses. This train will soon meet another UP train of only 3 cars, missing its head-end mail cars, but nevertheless keeping its schedule for the few passengers using the Butte Special, train number 6. How the Union Pacific became the modern-day titan of North American railroading is an interesting story that is also a significant part of U.S. history. The 1969 Transcontinental Celebration at Promontory, Utah, marked 100 years of a nation connected by rail. The reenactment of the Union Pacific coming from the east and the Central Pacific from the west, spiking the last rails, telegraphing the message that it was, quote, done, unquote, was largely symbolic in 1869's real-life event. Many things would need to be done to take this early beginning and transform it into a healthy system. The early Union Pacific was a simple line from Omaha, Nebraska to a location just above the Great Salt Lake in Utah, which was still a territory and not a state. It connected to the Central Pacific, created by the Big Four of California. Eventually, the Central Pacific would become the Southern Pacific, and its rugged line through Cajon Pass into Sacramento, California, was for a time its key asset. Both roads would grow rapidly in trackage, but not in any secure way in the scramble to find traffic to support such long lines with mostly wild, undeveloped territory. This and several recessions left the Union Pacific in debt and in danger of even reverting back to the government's control. To understand the UP over the last 100 years, it's important to know the imprint that the Harriman years left on the company. He was short, wiry, very athletic, a crack shot with boxing and hunting as hobbies, and he started the Boys Club in his Wall Street broker days. He dabbled in small railroads in the Northeast at first, making the transformation from Wall Street broker to a railroad builder. This 1969 Illinois Central film reminds us how things could have been so completely different. In the 1890s, the Illinois Central came close to buying the Union Pacific. It would have been a natural for them. Edward H. Harriman was on the Illinois Central Board for his financial abilities as a broker, and he was partly responsible for the IC's solid financial situation, even in a tough period of recession that had weakened the Union Pacific and many other roads. The IC was largely a north-south line with renewed ambitions to expand westward to the Pacific. Picking up the Union Pacific would be one way to make that happen. As a trustworthy finance man, Harriman wound up on the board of the Illinois Central and was one of the proponents of expansion down to New Orleans by purchasing other roads in the late 1880s. His stay on the IC would give him the skills for his higher achievements on the Union Pacific. Harriman stayed with the IC through depressions and rate wars until his stay ended. The healthy IC eyed expansion of traffic to the west, and the Sioux City line was already close to link up with the UP and Omaha to the south. Under the cover of IC expansion interests, Harriman wedged his way onto the executive committee of the Union Pacific in 1898. Harriman wanted the UP committee chairmanship, and it was his by May 1898. His interests had moved from the IC fully to the UP by then, and it would check any future IC takeover. The old Union Pacific of the 1890s wasn't the total basket case that traditional Harriman legends seem to suggest, but it did have some problems that characterized all western roads, long stretches of light track with little business to feed it. Much of the old Union Pacific track had been carved out in a hurry to meet deadlines and with techniques that were already substandard by the late 19th century. With the economy already showing some signs of improvement, Harriman immediately started the improvement of the Union Pacific with $25 million for new equipment and track upgrades. The system was rebuilt in the next 5 years, reballasting over 2,000 miles of widened roadbed. New ties and heavier rail were laid to bring the track up to the best Eastern road standards. The track realignments to reduce grades were numerous, and one project in the Black Hills used over 130,000 men before it was finished. What had once been a narrow roadbed with spindly bridges, numerous power-robbing curves and grades was now the equal of any eastern road. Half the main line was double-tracked by 1910. 19 miles of bridges were replaced with the most modern designs. Trackside structures, shops, icing docks, and even stockyards were either improved or multiplied. By 1910, the traffic volume tripled, partly from a growing economy and partly from Union Pacific's competitive edge. The idea of combining with the Burlington was put forth to gain a road into Chicago, the nation's most important rail hub. To Harriman's regret, it was never to happen. The industry could have evolved into an entirely different shape if Harriman hadn't focused on the UP for his visionary plan. E.H. Harriman breathed success into the country's first struggling transcontinental. That success has been maintained for all these years. You can't discount the efforts of those who have been in charge of the UP since then, but it's fair to say that Harriman led the charge. Picking up the pieces of UP's bankruptcy days, Harriman fought to regain the lost Union Pacific holdings in Oregon and Washington, a region dominated by the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific. He often squabbled over territory in the Northwest with the famous railroad builder in the North, James Hill. Their growing disagreement began with the UP's access to the James Hill-controlled Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy for a stable Chicago to Omaha connection. But Harriman's style clashed with Hill's, and their fighting destabilized stock prices of many railroads in the West. This would eventually haunt Harriman with all the attention that it focused on the UP and SP merger. Meanwhile, the stakes were high if the UP was to grow and have access to worthwhile seaports and growing population areas. In a few more years, the Milwaukee would be serving the area, adding to the region's competition. Eventually, the UP was back. Territorial disputes were partially resolved and new trackage rights were exchanged with James Hill, giving UP a route into Seattle, Washington. There were opportunities for serving shipping to Asia, and Japan was becoming an industrial giant, opening more markets. Harriman once had plans for encircling the globe with ships and railroads. If he had lived longer, it might have happened. UP would also serve passenger travel growth from Seattle Station down to Portland, Oregon. The Central Pacific line from Ogden to California and the Southern Pacific was brought under UP control by 1901 after Collis P. Huntington's death. Now the UP had a completed connection from Omaha to Sacramento, California. Harriman brought the SP his standards of equipment and operation that brought greater flexibility and improved the purchasing power of the company. He poured millions into the weakened line and cut travel distance by cutting directly across the Great Salt Lake with an 11-mile earth fill and trestle building project. It looks simple on the surface now, however the lake had a habit of swallowing portions of the fill and trestle work, giving the impression that local legends were true. The lake had sinkholes that were bottomless. They battled the problem for several years using 2,500 men and endless trains of rock fill. When it was all done, the lake had swallowed 15 times the amount of fill than was first calculated. The combination of trestles and fill was replaced by 1959 with another large continuous fill, costing $50 million, and we can see the remnants of the Harriman project curving off in this 1969 view. As we pass by an area where a number of PFE cars once left the rails with loads of potatoes, we come to appreciate the maintenance required to keep an asset such as this one in top condition. The old trestle rotting in the salt and sun did its job for many decades, but now the UP has one unbroken stretch of earth fill to maintain with easier access for support equipment when needed. All during the original project, only one worker was badly injured due to Harriman's strict sobriety and safety rules. None were killed. It was not open to general passenger traffic until late 1904, when it was at last considered completely safe. Although the Supreme Court would break up the combined SP and UP systems in 1913, the two companies would continue to cooperate with run-through arrangements until recent times. The passenger train City of San Francisco was a joint operation by the SP and the UP. The city had a mix of UP and SP colors as a result. When the train was first operated as a streamliner in the 30s, it started in a dominant yellow color scheme with Union Pacific diesels. The Donner line was heavily redesigned and double-tracked during the Harriman years to better match the capacity of the Omaha to Ogden line. It was very common to see UP power mixed in with SP power on the old Central Pacific Donner Pass line of the SP. Even into modern times, the crews were all SP here, but it was sometimes a solid set of UP power complete with a UP caboose, such as this train of refrigerator cars. Many curves were removed, and grades were reduced by adding more tunnels and relocating large portions of the line. The original treacherous line of Donner Pass was made to be merely a difficult one. The largest difficulty has always been the deep snows that during severe snowstorms require an extraordinary effort to keep cleared off the tracks. It's an exercise that SP essentially perfected over the years. The Harriman years did much to improve the Southern Pacific's public image in those 12 years. The company, under Harriman's direct involvement, was placed at the government's disposal to provide transportation, food, medical aid, and shelter to thousands of earthquake victims in the 1906 San Francisco earthquake as one superb example. At the time, only the Harriman transportation system resources and management were a match for the task. The Harriman touch on the SP added signals for increased safety and track handling capacity. These Harriman-era signals are on the SP's Siskiyou line, and they survived until the line was finally closed by the SP. UP power often showed up on these SP tracks well after the Harriman merger of the combined UP and SP was broken up in 1913. The Siskiyou line is in yellow, and the Shasta line to its right would come later to improve the SP's access into Oregon and up to Eugene and Portland by way of Klamath Falls. In 1902, Harriman directed SP signal engineers to improve the semaphore signals to protect opposing trains, Before this, the signals could only prevent rear-end collisions. On eastern roads, such as the Pennsylvania, you could just add other tracks and use the single-direction signaling. Out west, with long stretches of single track, it was vital to Harriman's enforcement of safety to prevent head-on collisions. It would also increase track capacity as a side benefit. Harriman also worked with Senator William Clark from a 1903 agreement to complete a much-needed line from Ogden, Utah, down to Los Angeles, California by 1905. The Mormon interests in Utah were disappointed that the original UP line bypassed Salt Lake City by passing through Ogden to meet the old Central Pacific in 1869. Now, Salt Lake City was a place on the way to Southern California, and the city was assured of growth. All the settlers in the area would now have a better future. Vast mineral deposits such as coal, copper, and iron, and a number of industries would develop around Salt Lake City, Provo, and outlying areas in Utah. UP's City of Los Angeles passenger service was a familiar face in the desert for years with its standardized E-unit power and gleaming passenger cars. From Ogden through Salt Lake City and southwest to Las Vegas, the Union Pacific was carved out of miles of wide-open spaces that generated very little traffic. From the cities clustered around the Great Salt Lake, it's nearly 450 miles to the next large city, Las Vegas. This vintage view is of the Art Deco-style Union Pacific station built in 1940. Sadly, it was replaced in 1971 by the Union Plaza Hotel Casino as a passenger station in Las Vegas. Las Vegas is one bright spot in a burning desert that sees routine temperatures in the 100-plus range. Its principal attraction to the traveling public was and always has been gambling and entertainment. If the UP had picked another route into Los Angeles, this place may never have existed. It grew from a railroad camp town to a major city of another specialty in a big way. The UP also operated the City of Las Vegas streamliner between LA and Las Vegas to cater directly to gamblers and tourists. The yard in Las Vegas provided a place to hold trains and change crews and support some of the local branch line activities. The tracks run right through the center of town since the town grew up around the railroad. The UP uses Santa Fe tracks once it reaches Daggett, California, just outside of Barstow. The Santa Fe station in Barstow served both roads and continued to be an Amtrak stop until the late 90s when the Desert Wind was canceled. This is the major Santa Fe yard out west, and it serves as a freight classification yard and engine terminal. It once saw the Santa Fe Chief, the Super Chief, and the Grand Canyon, to mention a few. For this UP freight train, it was just another yard to run through. UP's closest yard is at Yermo, 13 miles back up the line, timetable east, where this westbound freight ran through before cruising through Barstow. The arrangement was finalized by 1905, where the UP could use Santa Fe tracks all the way to Colton, California. It saved the LA and Salt Lake line almost 94 miles of track building. It was helpful for Harriman to let the public believe that William Clark was the real builder of the line. It possibly helped in negotiating the trackage rights agreement with the Santa Fe. Clark's interest in the line was finally bought out by the early 1920s, and the references to the LA and Salt Lake Railroad faded from view in a few years. Here, a westbound City of Los Angeles is heading to the crossing of the SP tracks at Colton Tower. Once we're back on UP tracks, the train runs to the station at East LA. This train has picked up a lot of grime from its desert run on its normally well-scrubbed flanks. The station at East LA was opened in 1929 to help siphon off the crush of passengers in UP's old Central Station in downtown Los Angeles. The next and last stop will be at the 1939-built Los Angeles Union Passenger Terminal, 7 more miles down the line. The Los Angeles River is crossed, and the train runs by the Mission Tower, and it finally will wrap around the long curve into the throat of the passenger terminal yard. The station here is a stub-end type, and all the tracks dead-end. This terminal served the UP, the SP, and the Santa Fe before Amtrak's startup in 1971. Before Harriman completed the LA and Salt Lake, he came to realize the threat of a new growing empire of the Pacific Electric, built by Collis Huntington's nephew, Henry Huntington. The electric age was in full swing, and many proponents of electric trains were predicting the demise of steam. Expansion into Orange, Riverside, and San Bernardino counties was already cutting into revenues of Harriman's recent catch, the SP. Especially alarming was freight revenue losses. Plans to continue expansion down to San Diego, north to Santa Barbara, and eventually San Francisco were too much to bear. Where seaports would connect to rails was also a big issue that Harriman had to get control over. Harriman gained control of the PE and brought the PE into the SP camp once and for all. Huntington continued with the LA railway system he also built and did quite well with it, even turning profits. The LA Railway was a narrow gauge line that ran mostly on city streets and was therefore not a threat to freight traffic. The PE was built as a standard gauge line, and as it grew it became a feeder line for the Harriman roads, tapping into refrigerator and boxcar traffic. The sprawling PE crossed steam road tracks all over Southern California, and junction towers to control traffic were seemingly everywhere. The PE had its own electric locomotive fleet that shortly after World War II would gradually be replaced by diesels until SP absorbed the various lines in 1965. The automobile had also ended the PE's passenger business by 1961. The last few years of operation were under the MTA, which eventually became all bus operated. These steel blimps ran their last years on the old PE after the closing of Harriman's IER line in the Oakland side of the bay in 1941. This IER car would play its last days as MTA number 1516. Harriman died in 1909 before the 1913 Supreme Court's breakup of the combined SP-UP system. His time in the railroad world was brief but stellar in scope. The SP went off on its own, but with improved direction from Harriman's involvement. SP and UP would cooperate for many years and co-own the Pacific Fruit Express refrigerator car company. The UP continued to prosper as many other roads went in and out of receiverships and bankruptcies. The opening of the Panama Canal in Harriman's day was direct competition to transcontinental freight business, but in time of war, rails were a secure corridor for the war effort, all without the risks that ships using the Panama Canal would have from submarine attacks. Number 2264 is a 282 mic from the Common Standards era on a Cajon Pass westbound, followed by 5518, a 1924-built Baldwin 210-2. World War II showcased how railroads could tie a large country together, coast to coast, as one efficient war production machine. The U.S. railroads operated in a relative calm to transport troops and war material from coast to coast. The importance of railroads in wartime is illustrated by these Allied attacks on German rails to disrupt their war capacity. This is something that U.S. railroads didn't have to contend with, and they went about their business without concern, except for the risk of sabotage. The war took Depression-level business and tripled it, and even after the war, the volume for freight remained high. This 282 was a Harriman-era common standard design that was still running in 1955. The back of the tender is lettered OWR and N. Oregon-Washington Railway and Navigation, which was a 1,500-mile portion of the UP system. This 1923-built Alco was originally built for the LA and Salt Lake line with a 482 wheel arrangement. It retains its history as an LA and Salt Lake locomotive with a small reporting mark at the bottom right of the cab this late in its career. The UP had an appetite for more power during the war, and this ex-Norfolk and Western Malley was one of many used on the Butte line and in helper service over Sherman Hill. These 4664s were less suitable for fast mainline service compared to the Challenger class and big boy models. This is a World War I vintage Baldwin 282 with a local. It carried 9,000 gallons of water. The frequent stops for water to keep locomotives under steam was one reason for the eventual dieselization. UP began replacing road power with diesels by 1947 with the EMD F3 model. They skipped over the earlier FT version since they were well equipped with modern steam power during the war. The F3s were much improved over the FTs. Steam would still have work, especially in helper service, until 1957, when steam classes were stored away one by one for the call that would never come again. UP worked with GE to create the turbine-powered locomotive, touted as an alternative to the diesel. The baby turbines produced 4,500 horsepower. They had a heavy appetite but could run on cheaper Bunker C fuel oil. These had a total of 8 traction motors. The UP liked the idea of heavy fast power to run its trains in the busy Omaha to Ogden corridor. The fact that they consumed great amounts of fuel sitting in a siding was no concern for this double-tracked line. Trains simply should not sit idle in the first place. The last group of 30 were the 8,500 horsepower big blow models built in 1958 to 61. These were essentially jet engines that produced electric power for the traction motors. They had a deafening roar that made them unpopular in heavily populated areas, and the availability time wasn't as high as their contemporary diesels. They were all off the roster by 1969. The grand experiment was over. By then, EMD had been offering turbocharger-equipped diesels that produced more power, such as these 1963-built Jeep 30s. GE had already shifted its emphasis to diesel production, and a horsepower race was on. When these 1947-built F3s were new, EMD was offering 1,500 horsepower with good product reliability. To maintain reliability, they would resist using turbochargers with the Roots blower-equipped diesel for another 12 years when the Jeep 20 was offered. The F3 had the company of 56 of the newer F7 and FP7 models until 1963, when the F3s were retired or rebuilt as F7 or F9 versions. Alco was a longtime supplier of steam power, and during the war, they were restricted from offering diesel road power. This is a mix of Alco PA, FB, and PB units that were turbocharged diesels. They were built in the 1948 period, and the P models for passenger service offered 2,000 horsepower. UP only bought 14 PA and PB units. In many regards, they were great locomotives, but they suffered from early crankshaft and exhaust manifold failures. During the War Production Board did allow Alco to offer switch engines. The rest of their manufacturing capacity was assigned to building steam locomotives. While the decision served the country's needs well, it gave EMD a heavy edge over Alco that would haunt them to the end. The 1,000 horsepower turbocharged 6-cylinder diesel was a successful model for Alco, and they sold 54 to UP alone. These switchers with the characteristic Alco 4-cycle sound were reliable and liked by engineers. They spent their years picking around in small yards and industries, doing all the unglamorous work of feeding the system. The UP gave Alco another order for the similar S4 model in 1955, and they bought 45 more switchers. All the S model units were eventually retired in the early 70s. UP had GE and EMD diesels to maintain, and a third brand that was by then out of business was deemed unneeded. But the S model series sold almost 2,300 total in North America. This Santa Fe S4 had a similar story, and many of these Alcos run today on short lines. EMD first sold UP switchers in 1939 to 1942. This NW2 delivered 1,000 horsepower from 12 cylinders and was not turbocharged. UP owned 96 of these by 1948. UP operated 8 sets of 1951-built cow and calf TR5s for transferring cuts of cars between yards. The two units gave 1,200 horsepower total. This concept was replaced with the coming of the GP model series from EMD. The UP owned 30 Jeep 7s built in 1953. They quickly shifted railroad buying habits to the GP, or general purpose concept. This gave better operating utility and easier maintenance compared to the F7 locomotives that were otherwise identical in performance. These two 1,500 horsepower Jeeps eased past a water column for steam engines that would lose its purpose in a few more years. From 1954 to 1957, UP bought 324 GP9s that brought 1,750 horsepower and minor improvements over the original concept. They were useful switching yards and running on the main line with the most important freight trains. This dual mode was something unthinkable for F units. Borrowing an idea from the F units, they were offered in A and B or cabless versions. 5 were equipped with steam generators for reserve passenger duty. These Jeeps were the first volume-produced road switchers for EMD and the last to satisfy a market without resorting to turbocharging. Trains were growing in tonnage, facing stiff competition from trucks, and rail shippers were requiring faster service. The GE experiments with turbine power and turbocharged offerings from Alco gave a strong message to EMD. Huge locomotive consists appealed to rail fans, but not the cost accountants. In heavy grade locations, the UP didn't want to resort to helper locomotives as readily as the Santa Fe. Avoiding extra facilities and crews for helpers, plus the increased load of dispatching light power sets, was a matter of business style. By the late 60s, GP9s would be assigned to flatter assignments and locals. UP not only encouraged EMD to develop more powerful models, they also worked on their own to prove the value of turbocharging without sacrificing reliability. This Jeep 9 is one of 75 that were turboed by UP's shops to produce 2,000 horsepower. The ordinary Jeep was about to share its assignments with a better breed. EMD started the development of the SD24 and the Jeep 20 models that would emerge by 1959 to compete in a market demanding more output per unit. The Jeep 20 was a 2,000 horsepower model with the new standard low front hood, and it resulted in 30 sales to the UP. By 1963, the 2250 horsepower and more advanced Jeep 30 with its peculiar roof and cab styling was brought in with 76 units, almost evenly divided between A and B versions. They weren't perfect, but they started the long climb toward EMD domination of the four-axle road switcher market. The EMD Jeep 20 was rated at 2,000 horsepower, and the Jeep 30 was somewhat misleading at 2,250. The original designation was to be the Jeep 22, but with GE's release of the 2,500 horsepower U25B, the number 22 somehow seemed to be a marketing problem. EMD claimed that 30 was the proper number to indicate the 30 new improvements in the design. The third unit back is a Jeep 35 that was the last offering from EMD in 1963 using the 567 series diesel. The yellow Sperry rail car is visiting UP tracks in the LA area to provide its rail testing services. This special type of car uses magnetic induction to find defects in the rails before they become a safety problem. The service began in 1928 from original work and patents from Dr. Sperry, also known for his famous work with gyroscopes and navigational equipment. Let's return to Daggett, California, where the UP swings off Santa Fe's double tracks to its own line off to Las Vegas, Nevada. The Jeep 30 had an elaborate positive pressure air system to keep dust and dirt out of the engine room, which explains its lack of the expected numerous louvers on the side panels. Later, a westbound is headed by an SD24, which did produce 2,400 horsepower from its 16-cylinder 567D diesel. UP wanted 6-axle locomotives that could pull well up grades and also run at fast freight speeds. It was introduced in 1959, and UP bought 34 with a larger order for the 45B units. The rival Santa Fe bought 80 SD24s, but only UP bought the B units. The SD24 is easy to spot in either A or B versions by the 4 roof-mounted air tanks. To get a 3,000-gallon tank between the pair of 3-axle trucks, the air tanks wound up on the roof. It was either that or lengthen the frame. The second unit here is a Jeep 35 with EMD's 2,500 horsepower version of the 567 diesel. This would be the most expected from a 567 without adding cylinders. The only step up from this power rating was the double diesel with 2 Jeep 35s built into one long frame. The 5,000 horsepower single chassis dual engine was called the DD35. At first it was only offered as a B unit, and SP and UP were the only customers for this solution for more power. UP owned the only cab units, totaling 15. The DD35s were a stopgap measure for bigger things to come from EMD. Despite the low population of the DD35s, they seemed to be everywhere on UP's Western Front from 1965 until they retired around 1981. Another potential supplier was Fairbanks Morris with its unusual but powerful opposed piston diesel. These 2,400 horsepower demonstration Trainmasters were tested on the UP in 1953. It didn't result in sales to the UP, but this pair was bought by the Southern Pacific along with 14 others. Union Pacific's appetite for heavy turbine power was a strong factor in GE eventually breaking into diesel production. They had a long and good reputation for building pure electric locomotives, such as this Milwaukee box cab. They were very durable if a railroad was willing to build and maintain the overhead wiring to feed them. GE split up its engineering partnership with Alco and continued on as a mere supplier of electrical parts for Alco diesels. The GE traction motors were one of Alco's advantages. They could take a lot of abuse without problems. These Alco RS-27 demonstration diesels were bought by UP in 1961, but they would be retired in only 10 years. The last Alcos bought by UP were the Century models in 1966. They didn't make a good impression on the UP, and Alco would be out of business in short order. GE introduced their own diesel line and introduced the U-boat to the railroad world using the Cooper-Bessemer diesel. UP's 10 U-28Cs looked good on paper, but they suffered the same problems that the U-25B had earlier. A company the size of General Electric had the deep resources to work out problems and support their early units with warranty and trade-in plans. The U-boat nickname was coined after the U in the model designation, U meaning universal. The U-Series was just a first step for GE, and they would continue on with newer lines into the 80s and 90s. Eventually, GE would begin to eclipse EMD as a builder, but these U-28s were off the main line by the early 70s and off the roster by 1980. Here's a look at GE's bare rooftop on the U-28C compared to the various trailing EMDs here at Barstow. In 1963, GE built 23 special U-50Bs using 4 B trucks and a pair of 2,500 horsepower diesels to form the 5,000 horsepower monster that UP hoped would allow a 3-unit set to handle any train on the system. The idea was based on studies that each diesel added to a train had a fixed operating cost increment that was independent of its horsepower, so adding fewer units with higher power ratings could offer a savings. The span bolsters and trucks on these machines came from retired GE turbines. The second generation U-50C had a pair of 3-axle trucks taken from the retired Big Blow turbines. They had 6 versus 8 traction motors, and they were better suited for using their power generating speed instead of tractive effort. The U-50C diesels were turned around to put the radiators in the center, giving them a different look. Let's watch a pair of U-50Cs at speed near North Platte. EMD filled orders for double diesels, and the DDA-40X was its finest example. The 6900 was used to pull the 1969 Golden Spike Centennial Special passenger train from Kansas City to Salt Lake City. It used two 3,300 horsepower 645 series diesels to give 6,600 horsepower total. The project was accelerated to bring the unit to the ceremonies, and it was on display as the world's most powerful land vehicle. In a few months, men would walk on the moon, but for the time being, the DD-40 was the giant step for UP. On to Los Angeles for more public viewing. This was a Union Pacific model, and it was not listed in the EMD catalogs. Many of its electrical improvements would come in future EMD single-engine diesels. The Dash 2 line of EMD locomotives that were so successful in the 70s can trace their advantages to this locomotive. A hot eastbound TOFC is nearing the crest at Summit on Cajon Pass, using only 2 locomotives to conquer the 2.2% grade. EMD learned a lot by building the 47 DDA-40X machines, filling a need for power until the next generation of single-engine diesels could come close to their performance. The DD35 was an earlier EMD design to compete with the U50 model from GE. It was the internal workings of two 2,500 horsepower Jeep 35s on one long chassis to furnish 5,000 horsepower. This was the last and greatest hurrah for the 567 series diesel from EMD. These were built as cabless boosters in 1964 and later offered with cabs in 1965. UP owned 42 total and ran them into the early 80s. The SP was the only other customer for them, and they only owned 3 of the cabless version. This ABB Trio is working its way down the 3% grade on the south track on Cajon Pass. Off in the distance, another UP train is climbing the easier 2.2% grade on the north track with a more conventional SD40 on the point and a second DD35B. After all of UP's experimentation with heavy power, the 3,000 horsepower SD40-2 would eventually emerge as the standard for UP's road power. In 1972, UP started buying 682 of them. Down at the bottom of the Cajon grade at Devore, a passing eastbound Santa Fe train is about to begin its grind up the mountain as a pair of DD40s work their way down towards San Bernardino. Back up at Summit, the two tracks split up to take different alignments. This is where the south track converges back with the north track down at Cajon. Compared to the 2.2% north track, the south track grade is 3%, so it's used mostly for westbound traffic heading down grade. Before 1913, the south track was the original single line for all traffic. The second track adds several miles of extra length and a pair of short tunnels, but it cuts the grade down to a more reasonable 2.2%. The 3% grade shows its presence with lots of brake smoke. Off to the train's right is Sullivan's Curve in the north track. Visible to the left is a remnant of the old Route 66 that was broken up by Interstate 15, seen with the heavy traffic above. Smoking it up in Barstow is the same power combination we saw at Cajon. An SD40 mixes in with older power. SD40s began to fill the ranks as the standard power from EMD on the Union Pacific. The train has a pair of helpers near the end, which was somewhat rare for the UP, even on the line heading to Cajon Pass. Here at Hellendale, we catch two EMD double diesels teaming up with a GE U50C. Back up near Cajon Summit is Lugo with this westbound mix of power. Another westbound led by a DDA 40X. The first freight car is an ice bunker refrigerator car that was becoming a rarity. Mechanically cooled reefers like the two behind it had eliminated the need to re-ice cars. The ice bunker reefer was even more of a contrast to the early container cars that would begin to dominate freight traffic out west in a few more decades. Heading east down the grade is a set of four 6-axle SD45s. UP owned 50 of the 3,600 horsepower 20-cylinder EMD diesels. They were bought in 1968 and equipped with 90-mile-an-hour gearing until revised later for lower speed service. The new 1967 laid single track up the slope placed SP and Cajon Pass as a latecomer. We'll get a closer look at 3 of SP's SD45s. By 1980, most of the SD45s on the UP would be stored due to fuel cost increases and a business downturn still lingering from the malaise of the late 70s. The UP eventually switched their thinking to standardize on the 3,000 horsepower SD40-2, such as this solid set at famous Sullivan's Curve. The SD40-2 brought the advantages of an economical 16-cylinder 645 model with 6 axles and greatly improved electrical controls. The double diesels proved their worth to the UP, but they posed problems in the age of pool power and run-through arrangements with other railroads. Most railroads balked at a $500,000-pound locomotive with 4-axle trucks running over their system in a time when many roads had less than ideal track. The SD40 answered these problems. UP would begin to withdraw all the large and unique models by 1980. Let's watch a few more scenes on the UP before the standardization took hold. As the SD40s washed variety away, the passenger scene had also changed. Amtrak took over UP's passenger operations in 1971. And UP's great yellow fleet was given up to the effort. Let's look back at UP's finest before that happened. This eastbound has a pair of E8s and a trailing E3 built in 1939. The E8s and 9s were the mainstay locomotives of passenger operations from 1950 to the end of passenger service in 1971. Here's a rooftop look at a trio of E8s before all the modifications were added. Generally, the E8s had the lower light on the nose door and the E9s did not. The E9 also had 2,400 horsepower compared to the E8's 2,250. In 1955, the Milwaukee Road adopted UP's passenger train colors. The UP shifted their Omaha to Chicago connection from the Chicago and Northwestern over to the Milwaukee. If you look at many of the UP trains in this video, you'll spot Milwaukee passenger cars mixed in. The round and oval windows at the car ends is the giveaway. This Milwaukee train is heading out of Seattle to use all Milwaukee tracks back to Chicago. The Union Pacific City of Portland slips by, while a UP switcher works a local industry. Looking far to the south, we'll catch a few trains at Santa Fe's crossing of SP tracks at Colton. This is the UP shared track to Cajon Pass, and we'll catch a UP westbound City of Los Angeles train after the Santa Fe train runs by. Look for the two Milwaukee Road passenger cars in the UP train. Back at Los Angeles, the eastbound City of Los Angeles begins its trip by passing Mission Tower and crossing the LA River. This 1969 view shows a tremendous train length due to UP's combining several name trains into one to help cut operation costs. The train slips down the east bank of the river, and its first stop will be East LA. This station was a way to avoid the crowds at Los Angeles Station and was a convenient choice for many of the area's passengers. This was on a cold winter day, and the mid-afternoon almost looks like evening today. After a quick stop, the train blasts out of East LA. The UP line out of LA was a well-maintained track with a smooth ride for passengers. Here, an eastbound near Summit at Cajon after a 2.2% grade that slows the pace. The car behind the UP Dome is a Milwaukee-owned car. Time ran out on UP's passenger business. UP trains were always clean and service was good to the end. Amtrak would relieve most roads from passenger service by May 1971. UP leased and then sold much of its passenger equipment to Amtrak, and UP crews would still run the trains for a number of years. The well-kept UP E-units were some of the best units Amtrak had to use until newer locomotives were built for Amtrak to replace the aging E-units. Rail enthusiasts knew the end was coming, and many special trips were arranged with UP to get a few last experiences of UP hospitality. This trip, arranged with the Pacific Rail Society, went up to Cajon Summit and back. We run past Cajon's Mormon Rocks and up the north track to the two short tunnels headed by 4 E-units. At the top, the power is attached to the rear of the train for the trip back down the hill using the steeper south track. The E-Series from EMD was a mass-produced early double diesel. They had a pair of 12-cylinder 567s with Roots blowers and no turbocharging. This made a reliable combination with an acceptable amount of power for their day. In 1960, UP started thinking about a merger with the Rock Island Railroad. The goal was to have a stable connection from Omaha, Nebraska to Chicago, Illinois, the most important place in the country to connect to. By 1964, the deal was up for consideration by the ICC. It was also the end of the Rock's good years, and they would begin a long slide into oblivion. The UP could have turned the Rock into a first-class line, and at the time it wasn't in bad condition. However, the ICC dragged its feet until an astonishing 1974 date to finally approve the merger. By then, the UP was no longer interested in salvaging a near disaster. The formal name was the Chicago, Rock Island and Pacific, one of the Midwest's oldest lines. The line from Chicago to Omaha was a direct line. It would also have offered UP coverage into parts of the South and Texas with its growing economy. In 1966, UP bought 20 U-28Bs with Rock Island numbers 262 to 281, and the UP leased them to a cash-short Rock Island to help prop them up. The clock was ticking and the merger approval was always just out of reach as each objection to it was reviewed and dismissed by the ICC. By 1980, the UP was forced to repossess the U-28Bs and the Rock was bankrupt. UP watched as mergers between the C&O and the B&O were approved, as well as the Pennsylvania and New York Central merger to the east. Another merger that took 10 years was in the works and it finally won approval. In 1970, the UP faced its biggest threat of the 20th century, the merger of all the former James Hill lines that haunted the Harriman legacy. The Burlington Northern merger rolled up the CB&Q, the Great Northern, Northern Pacific, and the SP&S lines into one super road that would grow to a 25,000-mile system. Back in Harriman's day, the UP tried to persuade James Hill to give the UP connections from Omaha directly into Chicago over the CB&Q by a partnership arrangement as part of the community of interest that Harriman wanted to create. Hill's refusal split Hill and Harriman apart into permanent foes, and the problems from this spread to Harriman's business like interference ripples on a pond from then on. The corporate identity for Burlington Northern was green, and the paint was rapidly erasing the old faces into one new and focused railroad. BN was also getting help from WP. The Western Pacific was gradually making improvements in business volume while controlling its costs under Alfred Perlman and Ed Flannery. Ironically, all the progress was in the middle of a recession. The WP was looking attractive as a merger partner, and they wouldn't remain independent for long. The SP line in red from the east was through famous Donner Pass. The WP in yellow had the entry from the east through the Feather River Canyon and from the north with its connection to the BN at Bieber, California. This BN-powered run-through train is on WP tracks, and it will connect to the WP main line at Ketty and continue down to Stockton, California, where much of the train will be handed over to the Santa Fe. This 1931-built High Line, or inside gateway between the old Great Northern and the Western Pacific, was a way for the WP to bridge together the Great Northern and the Santa Fe and wrest business away from the Southern Pacific. The heavy yellow line shows the WP from Oakland through Stockton and east to its connection with the Rio Grande. This map shows in blue the Santa Fe's connection to WP at Stockton. Watching this BN WP inside gateway train, you can see the type of traffic and the car owners to gain an idea of the line's value. The original idea of the WP was to cut into SP's east-west monopoly. The High Line, added later, was to break the monopoly held by SP's Shasta line for the north-south traffic. The SP and Santa Fe both attempted to merge with the Western Pacific by 1962. If it had been approved, it would have complicated UP's opportunity to have a secure connection to Northern California. An SP owning the WP would give SP too much power over UP's traffic from Ogden to the Bay Area. A Santa Fe owning the WP would make the inside gateway more meaningful to the BN, with the third party out of the cost of operation. Oakland in the 70s was a place to see both UP and SP power at the old West Oakland Yard. The old CP-UP agreements from the 19th century arranged for the Union Pacific trains to be handed over to what would become the Southern Pacific to get Union Pacific's haulage into Northern California. What UP needed was its own yard and a set of tracks into this Northern California market. In 1980, the BN absorbed the 4,600-mile St. Louis and San Francisco line, anchoring their interests in the South, including Texas. The BN was still expanding, and the UP had yet to clinch a merger of its own. The Milwaukee Road had been eager to involve itself in a merger. A Milwaukee merger with a Rock Island was proposed as early as 1959. With the announcement of the Rock Island and UP merger, the Milwaukee hoped it could throw itself at a suitor, if one was interested. The Milwaukee even held out hope that the BN would show interest in merging at one time. If the UP had been interested in the Milwaukee, it would have taken major improvements to bring it up to UP's standards. The UP would have been faced with a partly electrified road with antique equipment. The only ray of hope in the Milwaukee's struggle was its short-term ability to steal large chunks of business from BN in the Pacific Northwest. Unfortunately, the Milwaukee closed that part of the line down to avoid the high cost of modernizing it, and the end came swiftly after that. It would be chopped up into fragments just like the Rock Island. The Missouri Pacific line had the Chicago to Omaha connection that UP needed. In 1976, it had also absorbed the Chicago and Eastern Illinois shown here with a Missouri Pacific-style paint scheme. The Texas and Pacific was also absorbed into the mix. The UP's announcement to merge with the Missouri Pacific, often called the MOP, was in 1980. The Omaha to Chicago link wasn't the most direct, but it would do. The 11,000 miles of the MOP brought extensive lines in Texas and down to Gulf ports. This merger went through by 1982 in a new climate out of Washington regarding railroads and mergers. MOP power would soon wear yellow paint but retain Missouri Pacific lettering for a few more years. At the same time, the UP also merged the Western Pacific into its operation. The WP was completed in 1909 with backing from George Gould, who was carrying on with his father's plan to link a number of lines into one transcontinental line. Crossing the desert from California through Nevada and into Utah, the SP and WP tracks paralleled and crossed each other. For years, they used their tracks in a paired track operation. The SP and WP both ran out of the Salt Lake, Utah area, and they both had crossings of the Great Salt Lake. The SP made its connection with the UP at Ogden, while WP made its connection with the Rio Grande. When the UP and WP merger was approved by the ICC, the SP lost a lot of traffic that would normally be routed through their Donner Pass line. The long cooperation between SP and UP had already been deteriorating for a few years, and by 1978, the jointly owned Pacific Fruit Express business was broken up. The PFE cars were split up into UPFE and SPFE lettered cars, each seeking their own separate customer base. The refrigerator car traffic had been dropping during the 70s through recessions and loss of traffic to trucks with the expanding interstate highway system. The UP now had a single-track line through Feather River Canyon that boasted of a 3,000-foot lower maximum elevation than the Donner Pass line. Winter snowpack was less than SP's Donner line, and the grade was a constant 1%, less than half of Donner's. It added about 150 miles to the distance to use the Beckworth Pass and Feather River Canyon route as a trade-off. Other than a few problems, it fit UP's style well. The main problems with the line are the rock slides, occasional floods, and the narrow foothold along canyon walls that limits adding or extending passing sidings. As UP absorbed the Missouri Pacific and the Western Pacific, it would sell off most of WP's power and retain much of the Missouri Pacific power repainted in armor yellow. The Western Pacific never owned diesels with 6-axle trucks, and after the UP took hold of things, the standard power would be 6-axle EMD and GE units. The UP even operated the huge 8-axle, half-a-million-pound DDA-40X machines through the canyon when traffic loads demanded it in the early 80s. That was WP's antique collection of F units running on the San Jose turn through the ultimate pass. Those holdouts from an earlier era of railroading were now living on borrowed time. They made it up to the UP merger, but the idea of running power this old would not fit the new plan. UP donated the remains of the WP's F unit fleet to railroad museums for preservation. These F7s were rebuilt by WP just for this duty in the 70s. For rail fans, they were a highlight of rail fanning in the area. They also represented WP's own way of doing the most with what they had. The extra service years they delivered saved the WP from buying more motive power than they could afford. The result kept the independent line in good business form until someone could absorb it into better times. The new order would be yellow UP modern power and a series of track improvements. This westbound is crossing SP tracks at Niles. The train will call on Hayward, San Leandro, and then Oakland, California. This scene shows a UP train with power standardized in EMD SD40s and a GE. Finally, the UP had its own way into the Oakland-San Francisco Bay Area market. The payoff for UP was the port in Oakland and the growth of intermodal traffic. Looking back, the old WP was blocked at every turn coming into the area, ironically by none other than E.H. Harriman. He wanted to keep Oakland and its harbor access an SP exclusive. The growing empire of George Gould financed the WP's creation. Harriman and Gould had already ended their affable days. Running down Oakland's 3rd Street was the only access to WP's cramped little yard. Now it would have to serve UP for a while at least. A set of diesels like this could only be put together on the UP, but they would be retired soon. This train is adding some work equipment to a westbound freight at Evanston, Wyoming. The early 80s marked the UP getting down to business on its Omaha to Ogden line, but now with improved controllable connections at both ends. While UP's traditional line simply kept performing in the usual fashion, the new system additions would go through many changes. UP would depend less on the SP for run-through arrangements, and the SP's business would take a downturn as a result of routing more traffic over the WP. We'll turn to Northern California to see some vignettes of how UP fits into its new territory. The Western Pacific system had some interesting operations that UP would inherit, and the local on Santa Fe tracks to an old Sacramento Northern customer was one we'll see during the mid-80s. This Santa Fe train reminds us that the Santa Fe's fortunes would slide in the 80s just as the SP's would. The SP and Santa Fe merger was started as a response to the BN and UP mergers, but the SPSF merger was denied by the ICC, leaving both roads in a tailspin for a while. Pulling out is a UP trackage rights train, first run in the 50s by the WP-owned Sacramento Northern subsidiary. The U.S. Steel plant in Pittsburgh, California would still be served by UP trains such as this one, powered by ex-Western Pacific Power. The old Sacramento Northern was the West's longest electric line, running from San Francisco to Sacramento, up to Marysville and Chico, California. This 1960 scene shows a remnant of electric operation at Marysville, where it connected with the WP. The orange and silver diesel in the background is a GE 44-ton. The black locomotives here were pure electric, dating from the 20s. After the electric system cutbacks in the 50s, the WP furnished diesel power to the SN, and it was common to see ex-WPF units running steel cars on Santa Fe tracks out to Pittsburgh to serve U.S. Steel. The SN provided the WP with an extensive feeder system, although most of it is gone by now. These 1985 views of steel coil and gondola cars show how the traffic had actually grown. Let's watch two more trackage rights trains run by. This map shows main lines in the Sacramento and Stockton area. The red is SP, the blue is Santa Fe, while green is WP. The important junction in Stockton featured a tower that has since been removed. This 1985 era UP train is leaving Santa Fe tracks to return to the old WP yard in Stockton, headed by an ex-Western Pacific GP40-2. Almost 20 years later, the power for the Port of Stockton local is an ex-Katy GP40, followed by an ex-Missouri Pacific Jeep 15. Listen to the difference between turboed and the trailing unit's non-turboed exhaust sounds. A pair of ex-MOP Jeep 15s eases by with cars still lettered for Missouri Pacific and Western Pacific on a UP local on SP tracks near Hagen and Sacramento. The same train uses the Y at Hagen to get back on the old WP main line that crosses under the SP tracks. A former Katy Jeep 40 switches cars with paper at the Sacramento Bee newspaper siding. GE 9001, ex-MOP 1985 built C36-7, leads a family line's SD40 on a Sacramento stack train. The C36 represents the GE's improved offering over the U series, and it started GE's new rise to eventually overtake EMD in the 90s. Two more trains at Hagen on the XWP main line. A rare breed in 2001, an XWP Jeep 40-2 at Davenport on the SP Santa Cruz branch with its blinded nose light group. And a GE C40-8 with an SD40-2. The SD40-2 is one of over 600 bought for UP's standardization wave of power from the 70s. The trailing unit will soon have no home. Conrail will be divided into two Eastern Road mergers. The LA and Salt Lake line is still a hot performer on the UP, with this seen just west of Las Vegas, Nevada. UP retained a good-sized fleet of passenger cars for its corporate use after the forming of Amtrak over 30 years ago. Much of this equipment is approaching 50 years of age. This train shows a good sampling of UP's pride in their operations. UP can claim to be the oldest surviving road in the U.S. of any appreciable size. It has been a pioneer in rail technology for the last 100 years. While it has grown in size, it has never lost time experimenting with its identity.